speeches about music, mainly singers, various songwriters. And I like to do those speeches because I'm comfortable with it and I can speak relatively intelligently about those things and not embarrass myself. So today I thought I'd talk about the Supreme Court. And we'll make it kind of a civics lesson, and it won't be just the Supreme Court, a little bit about our court systems. Now, a few of you might be thinking, Tom, what does music have to do with the Supreme Court? Now, that's a reasonable question, and you'll have to trust me that I'm going to get back there in a few minutes. But first, how many associate justices on the Supreme Court?
9.
8.
Right, there's 8. There's 8 associate justices plus the Chief Justice. Who's the Chief Justice currently on the Supreme Court? John Roberts is right. He replaced William Rehnquist in 2006. How many women on the Supreme Court?
Too many.
That's a perfect lead-in here. There are 3 women on the Supreme Court. I'm not here to talk about equality. And I make that point because I want to demonstrate to the female members of TGIF that I've matured and I'm more gender conscious than some people obviously than I used to be years ago. And about 25 years ago, I stood up here and I gave an evaluation of a lady in the Toastmasters group. And this was back when our $5 got us breakfast and we had real forks and knives on the tables. Well, I made a comment about the voice level of this lady, and the female members interpreted it as being very chauvinistic. I heard the term pig several times. Well, most of the female members proceeded to part with their knives and forks from their tables. Now, there may be an urban legend still floating around there that one of the knives actually ended up stuck in the wooden lectern that we had at the time. But I can verify that's not true, and I didn't actually get hit by any of the forks or knives.
But they feel like girls.
I did learn a very good lesson that I won't ever forget. And I could be one of the reasons that we no longer have food or weapons of mass destruction available for these speeches. Now let's get back to that music Supreme Court thing that I started this speech out with. In 1985, I was sitting at home reading the Kansas City Star, and I came across one of these little articles that just kind of jumps out and says to read this. And it was about John Fogerty. And most of you probably know who John Fogerty is, but for those who don't, he was the lead singer-songwriter for Creedence Clearwater Revival, CCR, back in the late 60s and early 70s. He went on to have a solo career, and he's actually issued 10 albums since 1985. In 1985, he came out with his first real album since the breakup of CCR, and it was titled Center Field. And the title song is a baseball song that I'm sure Laurel's familiar with. It was actually recently voted number 7 by Sports Illustrated of best all-time sports songs, sports-related songs. Another song on that album was The Old Man Down the Road. Now, when CCR broke up, they were contractually obligated to do 8 more albums. And obviously with no band, they couldn't very well do that. So as part of the settlement, John Fogerty agreed to relinquish all rights to the songs that he wrote as a member of CCR. So he was being sued by Fantasy Records for plagiarism, and they said that The Old Man Down the Road was the same as Running Through the Jungle, the CCR song, with different words. So when I read this article, and I thought it was kind of ironic that he's being sued for copying his old song. But I had this image jumped out in my mind of sitting there on the jury watching John Fogerty play these songs and go through chord progressions and show the notes and demonstrate how these songs were actually different. And after I read the article, obviously time went by, but every year or two, I'd continue seeing small articles about this court case. And what had happened, the plaintiff, Fantasy Records, had sued John Fogerty, the defendant, for copyright infringements, okay? John Fogerty won that lawsuit. Look back to sitting there playing his guitar in the jury, but he demonstrated that he didn't actually plagiarize the song. Well, at the time, the legal rules and precedents for copyright infringements, if the plaintiff wins, the plaintiff receives damages plus court costs. But the defendant, if the defendant wins, the only way the defendant could recover court costs was if they could prove that the lawsuit was frivolous. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but trying to prove frivolity would seem fairly difficult to me. So the crux of the case, he had spent, John Fogerty, a little over $1 million defending himself for this lawsuit. So he countersued to recover his legal costs. And it went through the California state courts, the US federal courts, and he kept losing. It wasn't frivolous and he couldn't recover his court costs, and eventually went to the Supreme Court. Well, in 1994, the Supreme Court voted 9-0, which is rarity in the Supreme Court, voted 9-0 that defendants should have similar rights as plaintiffs for recovering legal fees in a copyright type lawsuit. Now, the only question I had after research and reading all this stuff was, what were the lower courts thinking when they went through all of these things? And why did it take the highest court in our land to make a judgment that seems pretty common sense to me and fair? So the court thing was all finished, and we're going to start seeing the lights come on here in a second. I brought all these fancy graphs and charts, and I was going to talk about the Supreme Court and this and that, but I don't think you really want me to talk about that anyway. So I'm gonna leave you with two thoughts today. Number one, it's important that you understand the court systems and our legal systems here in the United States. Many of you are entrepreneurs, writers, business owners, and the more that you know and understand about that, the better you would be if you ever happen to get into legal situations. And I can tell you by experience that by the time you get into a legal situation, it's almost too late. And a few years ago, I had a situation where a friend of mine was actually arrested for murder, and I had to try to help do some things. And I can tell you that if I would have known more, I could have made better decisions, better judgments in my assistance of that. And maybe in future speech I'll talk about that a little bit more. The second thing I'd like to leave you with is the Supreme Court's an interesting body. I used to think that whatever the Supreme Court did had very little influence on me. But the fact is that the decisions the Supreme Court makes are legal precedents that are set for years, decades, even centuries in the future, and it affects all of our lives. The current court is basically a block of four conservatives, what I'll call conservatives: Roberts, Thomas, Scalia, and Alito. And the liberal bloc, Stephen Byers and the three women, Ginsburg, Sotomayor, and Kagan. The swing vote right now tends to be Anthony Kennedy, who's really pretty conservative. And this is, since I've been watching the Supreme Court over the last 15, 20 years, this is the most conservative court that I've ever seen. So it's an interesting body. I'd encourage you to research it. And that's enough civics lessons for today. So you have a nice weekend.